Hello and welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl, and my guest today at University Bookstore is best-selling author Karl Marlantes. Karl, thank you so much for making the trip down to Seattle.
That's great.
So you have a new novel out called Deep River.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this novel?
Well, lots of things. I mean, like most novels, but first of all, I grew up on the Oregon coast in a logging town. And one of the things that I remember from my childhood is literally I'd be in grade school and the floor would tremble as the log trucks would barrel through town because they were paid by the load, so they went fast, even right through town. And there was one log on that truck, one log, that's all they could fit. Today, that same size truck has about 35 or 40 logs on it. And so one of the things that I wanted to try and capture was the story of these people that are, you know, you're my size, and these enormous trees. And my great uncle told me once that sometimes it took him a couple of days to get one down. 12-hour days, you know, 20 minutes off for lunch, that's all they did. And it took, because these things were huge, I mean, 12, 16 feet across. And so just the irony that heroism and deaths and maimings, and we're left with no old growth forest. I mean, those days are gone. The other is my Scandinavian heritage. I mean, my mother's first language was Finnish, and of course, her mother's first language was Finnish, and she was a communist, my grandmother. One of the things I love to talk about is that when I was a child, I'd see the Daily Worker on the kitchen table. I thought it was the local Astoria newspaper. I really did. I mean, I'm only 8 or 9,
right.
You know, and it turned out later, oh, that's anyway, and so I have stories from her, and then there's also two things. One is I woke up in the middle of the night, it's probably about 30 years ago, with this image of my grandmother looking out on the Columbia River. And she had once told me, she was a strong atheist in the sense of traditional religion, but I said, do you not believe in anything, Grandma? And she said, well, I think the Columbia River is God. And that struck me, you know, and it's the theme of the river is huge in this novel. It's the cycle of life, and that became the last scene in the novel, and I wrote it down 30 years ago and just sort of stayed there. I also got very interested in Norse sagas. I had the opportunity, I can really nerd out. When I was at Oxford, I took a course in Old Norse poetic diction.
Wow.
Oh, yeah,
wow.
Where else can you find that? That's right, yeah. And it was taught by Emily Dronke, who was the Vigfusson Professor of Ancient Icelandic Antiquities.
Wow.
Is that a great title?
That is.
That's great. Well, anyway, I was the only one who didn't speak 3 dead languages in the seminar, but I started reading these Old Norse sagas, and it was about the settlement of Iceland by the Norwegian Vikings. And I started thinking, I wonder what it would be like to transfer a saga to the Northwest, and where the settlement of the Northwest by Finns and Norwegians and Swedes, which was very, you know, would be similar. And then finally, I'm very into mythology, as you know, and I started reading the Kalevala, which is a Finnish national epic. It's sort of like the Táin for the Irish or Song of Roland for the French. And it was very important to Finnish identity in the 19th century. They were struggling under Russian rule. And the Russians were trying to Russify the place, which means, you know, wouldn't allow Finn to be spoken in government circles. And so this was the original early, I mean, these are songs that were collected by a guy named Elias Lonrot. And he was sent to the Kalevala district. La means from the place of in Finn, so Kalevala is where it comes from, Kalevala district. And he started hearing these really ancient songs that were just sung by the old people, never written down, and started to realize that the songs had the same characters in them. And he collected them and he put them all in one place and wrote very fine poetry to capture these songs. And it's called the Kalevala, and it's about what scholars basically think were probably very powerful shamans way back, pre-Christian for sure, because the Finns don't have the Nordic pantheon. There's no Freya or Thor or anything. No, they're more into more like Native Americans' animism, like there's river gods and wind gods and things like that. And so all of that, you know, sort of gets thrown into my head and melded around, and I just finally outlined the novel and away I went.
One of the things that I found so interesting about the book, partly because I love history so much, is the way you make the reader aware of Finnish history and the difficulty of Finland's position vis-a-vis Russia. And I thought that that gave such like a grounding for the book, to sort of give us a sense of where these three siblings came from, not just literally, but figuratively.
No, definitely. I mean, I think that there's several things going on in my head at the same time. Certainly there's the history, and the Finns who came to America, they were much more radicalized than other immigrant groups, because other immigrants would come from countries where if you had to rebel, you had to rebel against your own country. In Finland, they rebelled against a foreign occupier. So that was different. And the other thing that I found fascinating is that the Finnish church wouldn't confirm you until you could read. And even the lowest peasant in Finland learned to read. And that's a very big difference between these immigrants. And so that background of coming from a place of oppression, coming from a place of, you know, you're getting drafted into the Russian, well, it wasn't they called it the Finnish army, but it was really the same thing. And fleeing that, it's very similar stories that we have today. And what they faced when they came, absolutely, some things just don't change. And no language, and Finnish is very different than an Indo-European language, and the difficulties of that. And then also just the particular history of that family. I mean, I set it up so there was a tragedy in the beginning, and I hope I don't give much away because it's right at the beginning.
Right, no.
Each of them comes out of that tragedy with a very different attitude toward life. That sets their stance, and we all take these stances. I mean, in general, it's like, you know, hedonism. I mean, there are foodies, right? People who are into wine and stuff, and and then there are people, traditionally religious people, and there are people that are, you know, the world's going to be better if we just have communism. Heaven on earth. You know, we all have these stances that basically, I think, help us get through the fact that we're going to die. And so all of my characters have a different stance toward life. Maddie just wants to get rich. But they love each other. They get along. They have Thanksgiving dinner together in spite of these fundamental differences. And so I think there's a bit of an allegory in the novel about, look, you know, you can have a complete difference of opinion from somebody. You don't have to make them the enemy. You know, you can be in the same family.
Yeah,
you know?
And I think also the way the siblings grew up is so much foreshadowed by their childhood experiences and who came to America first and missed those terrible things that happened to the mother and to the brother and sister.
Yes, definitely. It was. I mean, that was a very conscious on my part.
Yeah. Another thing that I think you said, not in the book, but I think you were talking about your grandmother again, that she was a red.
Yes.
And she wouldn't let her children talk to the whites,
exactly,
who were the anti-communists.
That's right. Yeah.
I thought that was
the Finnish Civil War, like all civil wars, it happened when Finland broke from Russia in 1917, when the revolution happened in Russia. That was their opportunity. But of course, as soon as they went for independence, then the factions, the radical communists, the Bolsheviks in Finland, and what my grandmother derisively called church Finns, but people that didn't want communism. And there was a civil war, and it was a vicious, ugly civil war. And as most civil wars, horrible atrocities on both sides. And that was carried over. And when even in the 50s, that's what the story I was telling you. When I was in Astoria, I would come home with the wrong friend. And it was like, no, they're church Finns, you can't play with him, And I had no clue, but I just knew that, well, whatever it was, Grandma was not happy.
Right.
And because of that bitterness and anger about a horrible Civil War.
Right. And it's hard to recover from that.
It is. I think that, I think about the Vietnam War. You and I are the same generation. It still reverberates with us. I think that controversy will only die when we're gone. It's American Civil War.
Right.
Decades and decades.
100 years.
Yeah, it's 100 years.
And more.
Yeah.
So the cover of Deep River is such a powerful image of a young boy standing, looking at these logs, these enormous logs. And I know that you had input into the cover.
Yes.
Could you talk just a little bit about that?
I had Grove is wonderful to me, and they're great, and so they give me a lot of chance to get my 2 bits in. And they had sent me an idea for a cover, and it was typical New Yorker East Coast. Their idea of a big tree, it looked like a limb, and it was laying down in a lake, and it was, I said, this is just not going to do. And so then they sent back another idea, the same problem. They had no concept of what these forests and these trees looked like. So I actually sent some photographs, and then their artist went to work, and she came up with, I think, is a great cover. I think this is a wonderful cover. It just sort of jumps at you and gives you some idea of scale. The old picture's worth 1,000 words, and wow, look at how little that person looks, Well, that person took that tree down with a handsaw.
Yep, that's why it took so long to do those. When I think about logging in the Pacific Northwest, and I think about novels about logging in the Pacific Northwest, I think of sometimes A Great Notion, Ken Kesey's great novel. Did that did that book have meaning to you because you grew up in Astoria?
Oh, yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Yes, I can. I think it's his best novel.
I do too.
Yeah, no doubt. Jack Nicholson made the other one famous.
Right.
Right. Cuckoo's Nest. But yes, for starters, he captures what we call the Jippo logger. And I don't know where that word comes from. It doesn't mean somebody bad or cheater or something like gypsy or something, but it's a small company, usually family run. And Kesey captured how hard it is to make one of those businesses go, and the attractions of it, the fascination of it, and the toughness of it. And this is about a union fight. And growing up, again, in the Northwest, the unions were very important up until basically the trees went away. And then that was the end of that. And so that was very important to me. And also because, quite frankly, I was a kid left my logging town and went to Yale, and here's Leland Stamford Jr. or whatever his name is, and he comes back to his logging town. I kind of identified with him, and so that was a big part of the novel as well. And I always, had this feeling for Ken Kesey because he was such a romantic figure for my age. He was probably 10 years older than I am, and the merry pranksters and dropping acid and, all over the country in that weird bus, so that was all very important to me because I think I read that novel when I was probably about 20.
Yeah. I think that's when I probably first read it, although at that time I was living in the Midwest, I think, I think I was still in Michigan. Yeah. So it didn't have the same meaning to me, and I think as it did to you growing up there and knowing that. But in that book, he does he makes that situation so real that even I...
and to tell you the story, I delivered papers, the Astorian budget, and I was like 9, and if you had to collect money at the end of the month, and if you didn't get the money, it came out of your pay, right? There was this Jippo logger named George Van Vliet, who was a tough SOB. I went and knocked on the door one Saturday, and he opens the door, and I said, you know, Mr. Van Fleet, I came here to collect for the, and he looks at me and he says, my paper was wet Wednesday night. I'm not paying you a GD cent. And he slammed the door in my face. I'm 9 years old, right?
Wow.
That's the kind of attitude it was. Well, a couple of days later, his wife saw me through the kitchen window and slipped me the money. But he was going to say, you know, if you're going to deliver a wet paper, we're not paying you, you know. And on one hand, you go, oh, he's an SOB, but the other hand, you go, that's the kind of toughness that it takes. And and it was a good lesson for me. I made sure his paper was dry from then on, you know.
Right, right. What your first novel, Matterhorn, was such a big success.
Yes.
And really, it was about Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, and something that was very important in your life, and very important in many people's lives, which I think is one of the reasons that the book was so popular, and the way you captured the complexities of being a soldier in Vietnam. Was it hard? Do you think that the success of that book made it more difficult for you to write a second novel? I know in between there was the why we go to why it is we go to war.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
I don't think it had any effect. The only effect is sort of after, is sort of like, gee, I wonder if it's going to be as well liked, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But when I'm writing and it's working for me, I'm unconscious of even being there. I mean, I write by hand, and it's just going like that. So there's not even a bit of thinking about what I've written before. So it didn't at all.
You were able, like, to shut off that critic in your head.
Well, that's why I write by hand, for starters, because if you do it, my theory about myself is I'm going like this, I'm not going to edit, because I'm just sort of in it, and it's closer to your unconscious and everything. The minute you're on that word processor, it's like, oh, well, I just click, 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 oh, go back, no, rewrite that. I mean, but, you know, and I'm kind of going like, that one doesn't work for me. And when I'm editing, of course I use the word processor, but I just let it rip, and like I said, when it's going well, I sort of wake up, and I'm no longer in 1905. It's like, gosh, I'm here, it's dinner time, and so it's a wonderful feeling. That's one reason I like being a writer. And then, of course, there's the days when you sit there and you write CRAP, you know, and then you have to throw it out, and that happens a lot too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the Ken Kesey novel. What were you? Did you grow up in a reading family?
Yes. I have to tell you a librarian story.
Oh, good.
All right.
I love those.
Little tiny town. The library shared the same building as the fire department's fire engine, the local volunteer fire. I mean, you could literally go, there was a little door, and there was the fire truck, and there was the library, and Mrs. Whitty was the librarian, and she was classic. Blue hair. You remember that?
Yes.
Like in the 50s? I don't know why their hair was blue, but anyway, these older women had blue hair and sensible shoes, and my father was pretty good psychologist, and so my big brother had gotten his library card. He's a couple years older than me, so I was like, Dad, can I get a library card? No, you're not old enough yet. You have to be old enough to have responsibility for these books. You know, I can't trust you with it. Someone, no, you know. And I'd ask him several times. You know, finally, I was about in the second grade. He says, "Okay, I think you're ready for a library card." And he had set it up with Mrs. Whitty. We went down to the library, and she's behind her desk, and my dad is standing there with his hand on my shoulder, and she has a library card that's this big with handwritten and scrolls on it with my name on it and everything, and she very seriously explains it to me and hands me my library card, and I'm very proud, and I have my library card, and after about a month or two of books and everything, my brother and I shared the attic in our house. And he's over standing looking at me, and he goes, "What's that?" "That's my library card." And he goes back to his bed and comes like, "Here's my library card." I realized I'd been had by my father and Mrs. Whitty. But anyway, yes, we grew up in a family with a lot of reading. There's no doubt about it.
Do you remember some of the books you read as a child?
Dr. Seuss, yeah, McElligot's Pool, and If I Ran the Zoo, and those were great. And I have to say, I read the story of the U.S. Marines, landmark books, you know, Betsy Ross, the maker of the American flag, and Thomas Jefferson and well, one of the books was the story of the U.S. Marines, and somehow that just really captured me. I ended up joining the Marines. I mean, these things have influence on you. They really do. One of the big influences, again, Mrs. Whitty, she got me interested in mythology. She ordered from the bookmobile every 2 weeks from Salem. The bookmobile would come, and she ordered a book, Yeats's Celtic Twilight. And it was about fairies and that hid in the walls, and I was just like, whoa, this is cool. You know, I was probably about 11 or 10 about that time. And so that started me off, you know, ended up Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and all the great mythologists. And so all of those things were quite important to me.
Was there a book that you read that made you feel like, oh, this is what I want to do when I grow up?
The book I admire most is War and Peace by Tolstoy. And I remember trying to read it when I was younger, probably 18, and I didn't, you know, all those Russian names, the usual complaints. And when I was probably about, I guess I was probably about 23 or 24. I'd already gone to a war. And I came back and started reading that novel, and I couldn't stop. I mean, I was literally up all night reading War and Peace. And I've read it a couple times since. Just the ability to capture the sweep of Russia, characters that, it's just like 3 sentences and you've got them, you know. And I begin to see, well, this guy is a genius. There's no doubt about it. And I said, oh, boy, that's cool. I mean, I wish I could write like Tolstoy. You know, I mean, that's the sort of thing. I always remember Robert Bly, who was a poet, that said one of the things, if you're a writer, you just got to get over is you're probably not as good as Shakespeare. You know,
deal with it.
Deal with it, exactly, yeah.
Were there other books on war that you read before you started working on Matterhorn?
Oh, yeah. I read the World War I poets who were very influential, Sassoon and Owens.
Did you read those when you were at Oxford?
Yes.
Because that would be so.
Yeah. And also when I was in
moving.
Vietnam, a girlfriend of mine sent me Wilfred Owen's complete poetry, and she sent it to me, and I got it there, and I was like, "Wow, this guy understands." I mean, he understood the randomness. The old idea was that if you were fast and you were good with your sword, you could somehow cut the odds. But by the time World War I came around, it's just like if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, the shell hits you, you know. And so they were important. Naked and the Dead was really a great novel. And
my father said that was the novel that was most like his experience in World War II.
Yeah, it was well done. Thin Red Line was good. Another one that I really found fascinating was by, gosh, come on, Carl, think of his name. It's called In Parentheses. And I think the man's name is Jones, because it's written by a Welshman. But he talks about how your life goes along with World War I, and then in parentheses is your life in the war, and then it goes on afterwards. And it was written in the 30s, and it dealt a lot with, it had a lot of Welsh mythology thrown into it as well. And that was an important book for me before I started.
I think one of my favorite books about World War I is called The Great War in Modern Memory by Paul Fussell.
I've read that, yes. It's really, really good.
Which talks about
its history.
Yes, the irony of World War I, where you could see England across the channel. And
right, you could hear the guns firing. I mean, it's amazing. Well, the other one that's a great World War I book is Goodbye to All That, Robert Graves, which talks about, you know, post-traumatic stress coming back. I mean, he went into the trenches when he was, I think, 18, you know, and spent 4 years there. Well, it did mess him up.
Yeah,
you know?
Right, right. Are characters really important to you in what you read or what you write?
Oh, yes. I think that characters are vital to a good novel, to good literature. And there's 2 sides to characters. First is from the reader's side. I think that it's one of the ways, and maybe the only way, that we can escape solipsism. That we see the world through our eyes, and and that's pretty limiting. But if you can get into a character, you can see the world through some other person's eyes. And I've told this story before. I've had this I had this experience. A godmother of my oldest boy was into Eudora Welty, and she kept trying to get me to read Delta Wedding, and I just, no, didn't want to do it. Finally, she just threw it on the table and said, read this book, and I read it, and I saw the world through the eyes of a woman in 1925 or whatever it was, Mississippi, who a wedding was so important and why it was important. I would have just blown it off. But now, when I see it, gosh, it's the symbol of the union of the masculine and the feminine, it's the civilization, it's everything was important. And the joke I like to tell is that throughout the novel, the little flower girls were dressed as shepherdesses, and they didn't have shepherd crooks, which were supposed to arrive in time. And the woman was getting frantic. And the first couple of times, like, oh, who cares? By the end of the novel, it was like, where are the shepherdess crooks? Why aren't they here yet? You know, and that's because it changed me. Yeah. It changed me.
Right.
That's what good literature does. On the writer's side, I think that the characters are from sub-personalities inside yourself. Things come out in the writing that sort of would surprise me. But those are, you know, unconscious images that are down in there that need to be brought to light. And some of the things that in the first drafts that I had my characters do were kind of mean, and I went, well, that's not really true to that character, but I guess that was probably part of me coming true to me. Yeah. And so it works both ways. And because of developing those characters, I grow. And I think that's the wonderful thing about writing literature, is that you yourself can grow.
Well, you've given us a great gift in both your novels.
Well, thank you.
And Karl, thank you so much for coming by today.
It's a great pleasure to be here to see you again. Thank you.